Right, hello everybody, this is Antonio Wolf here with Hyperion, Joshua, and fellow listener might chime in if they feel like it. Fellow friend. Continuing the trial, we're on chapter 7. It's 10 chapters, but this chapter is basically the size of 3 chapters so far. It's one of the longest chapters. It's about 30 pages, so we won't finish it today for sure. For those of you who are, for whatever reason, starting here, have landed here for some unknown, strange YouTube algorithm nonsense, here's something to entice you to listen to this entire thing from the very beginning. It's a whole playlist. Joseph K. is guilty. If you want to find out why, just go all the way to the beginning. And if you consider that a spoiler, then I don't know how you came upon this, because everybody who's heard about this book already knows the end.
You're probably guilty too.
Yeah. Everyone is guilty. We'll see why. Alright, so lawyer, manufacturer, painter. One winter morning, snow was falling in the dull light outside. Kay was sitting in his office, already extremely tired despite the early hour. He had told the servitor he was engaged in a major piece of work, and none of the junior staff should be allowed in to see him, so he would not be disturbed by them at least. But instead of working, he turned round in his chair, slowly moved various items around his desk, but then, without being aware of it, he lay his arms stretched out on the desktop, and sat there immobile, with his head sunk down on his chest. He was no longer able to get through the thought. He was no longer able to get the thought of the trial out of his head. He had often wondered whether it might not be a good idea to work out a written defense and hand it in to the court. It would contain a short description of his life and explain why he had acted the way he had at each event that was in any way important, whether he now considered he had acted well or ill, and his reasons for each. There was no doubt of the advantages a written defense of this sort would have over relying on the lawyer, who was anyway not without his shortcomings. Kay had no idea what actions the lawyer was taking. It was certainly not a lot. It was more than a month since the lawyer had summoned him, and none of the previous discussions had given Kay the impression that this man would be able to do much for him. Most importantly, he had asked him hardly any questions. And there were many questions here to be asked. Asking questions were the most important thing. Kay had the feeling that he had been able to ask all the questions needed here himself. The lawyer, in contrast, did not ask questions, but did all the talking himself, or sat silently facing him, leant forward slightly over the desk, probably because he was hard of hearing, pulled on a strand of hair in the middle of his beard, and looked down at the carpet, perhaps at the very spot where Kay had lain with Lenny. Now and then he would give Kay some vague warning of the sort you would give to children. His speeches were as pointless as they were boring, and Kay decided that when the final bill came, he would not pay a penny for them. Once the lawyer thought he had humiliated Kay sufficiently, he usually started something that would raise his spirits again. He had already, he would then say, won many such cases, partly or in whole, cases which may not really have been as difficult as this one, but which, on the face of it, had even less hope of success. He had a list of these cases here in the drawer. Here he would tap on one or other of the drawers in his desk, but could unfortunately not show them to Kay, as they dealt with official secrets. Nonetheless, the great experience he had acquired through all these cases would, of course, be of benefit to Kay. He had, of course, begun work straight away and was nearly ready to submit the first documents. They would be very important because the first impression made by the defense will often determine the whole process of the proceedings. Unfortunately, though, he would still have to make it clear to Kay that the first documents submitted are sometimes not even read by the court. They simply put them with the other documents and point out that, for the time being, questioning and observing the accused are much more important than anything written. If the applicant becomes insistent, then they add that before they come to any decision, as soon as all the material has been brought together, with due regard, of course, to all the documents, then these first documents to have been submitted will also be checked over. But unfortunately, even this is not usually true. The first documents submitted are usually mislaid or lost completely, and even if they do keep them right to the end, they are hardly read, although the lawyer only knew about this from rumor. This is all very regrettable, but not entirely without its justifications. But Kay should not forget that the trial would not be public. If the court deems it necessary, it can be made public, but there is no law that says it has to be. As a result, the accused and his defense don't have access even to the court records, and especially not to the indictment, and that means we generally don't know, or at least not precisely, what the first documents need to be about, which means that if they do contain anything of relevance to the case, it's only by a lucky coincidence. If anything about the individual charges and the reasons for them comes out clearly or can be guessed at while the accused is being questioned, then it's possible to work out and submit documents that really direct the issue and present proof, but not before. Conditions like this, of course, place the defense in a very unfavorable and difficult position. But that is what they intend. In fact, defense is not really allowed under the law, it's only tolerated. And there is even some dispute about whether... Sorry. I just found that very funny. In fact, defense is not really allowed under the law. It's only tolerated, and there is even some dispute about whether the relevant parts of the law imply even that. So, strictly speaking, there is no such thing as a counsel acknowledged by the court, and anyone who comes before this court as counsel is basically no more than a barrack room lawyer. The effect of all this, of course, is to remove the dignity of the whole procedure the next time Kay is in court. Sorry. Let me read that. The effect of all this, of course, is to remove the dignity of the whole procedure. The next time Kay is in court offices, he might like to have a look in at the lawyer's room, just so that he's seen it. He might well be quite shocked by the people he sees assembled. The room they've been allocated, with its narrow space and low ceiling, will be enough to show what contempt the court has for these people. The only light in the room comes through a little window that is so high up that, if you want to look out of it, you first have to get one of your colleagues to support you on his back, and even then the smoke from the chimney just in front of it will go up your nose and make your face black. In the floor of this room, to give yet another example of the conditions there is a hole that's been there for more than a year. It's not so big that a man could fall through, but it is big enough for your foot to disappear through it. The lawyer's room is on the second floor of the attic. That's a pretty big attic. If your foot does go through it will hang down into the first floor of the attic underneath it, and right in the corridor where the litigants are waiting. It's no exaggeration when lawyers say that conditions like that are a disgrace. Complaints to the management don't have the slightest effect, but the lawyers are strictly forbidden to alter anything in the room at their own expense. But even treating the lawyers in this way has its reasons. They want, as far as possible, to prevent any kind of defense. Everything should be made the responsibility of the accused. Not a bad point of view, basically, but nothing could be more mistaken than to think from that lawyers are not necessary for the accused in this court. On the contrary, there is no court where they are less needed. On the contrary, there is no court where they are less needed than here. This is because proceedings are generally kept secret not only from the public, but also from the accused. Only as far as that is possible, of course. But it is possible to a very large extent, and the accused doesn't get to see the court records either, and it's very difficult to infer what's in the court records from what's being said during the questioning based on them, especially for the accused who is in a difficult situation and is faced with every possible worry to distract him. This is when the defense begins. Counsel for the defense are not normally allowed to be present while the accused is being questioned. So afterwards, and if possible, still... reading this, whoever put this ebook together, I gotta thank them, but they missed a lot of little grammar things, and it reminds me that grammar is very important to be able to gauge the flow of sentences.
Yes.
for
It
speaking.
is true, AW.
Makes me far more self-conscious about my guilt of own my own not so great grammar. Alright, so what was it? Counsel for the defense are not normally allowed to be present while the accused is being questioned, so afterwards, and if possible, still at the door of the interview room, he has to learn what he can about it from him and extract whatever he can that might be of use, even though what the accused has to report is often very confused. But that is not the most important thing, and there's really not a lot that can be learned in this way, although in this, as with anything else, a competent man will learn more than another. Nonetheless, the most important thing is the lawyer's personal connections. That's where the real value of taking counsel lies. Now, Kay will most likely have already learned from his own experience that among its very lowest orders, the court organization does have its imperfections. The court is strictly closed to the public, but staff who forget their duty or who take bribes do, to some extent, show where the gaps are. This is where most lawyers will push their way in. This is where bribes are paid and information extracted. There have, even in earlier times at least, been incidents where documents have been stolen. There is no denying that some surprisingly favorable results have been attained for the accused in this way for a limited time, and these petty advocates then strut to and fro on the basis of them and attract new clients. But for the further course of the proceedings, it signifies either nothing or nothing good. The only things of real value are honest personal contacts with higher officials, albeit higher officials of the lower grades, you understand. That is the only way the progress of the trial can be influenced. Hardly noticeable at first, it's true, but from then on it becomes more and more visible. There are, of course, not many lawyers who can do this, and Kay has made a very good choice in this matter. There were probably no more than one or two who had as many contacts as Dr. Hoult, but they don't bother with the company of the lawyer's room and have nothing to do with it. This means they have all the less contact with the court officials. It is not at all necessary for Dr. Hoult to go to court, wait in the anterooms for the examining judges to turn up, if they turn up, and try to achieve something which, according to the judge's mood, is usually more apparent than real, and most often not even that. No, Kay has seen for himself that the court officials, including some who are quite high up, come forward without being asked, are glad to give information which is fully open, or at least easy to understand. They discuss the next stages in the proceedings. In fact, in some cases, they can be won over and are quite willing to adopt the other person's point of view. However, when this happens, you should never trust them too far, as however firmly they have declared this new point of view in favor of the defendant, they might well go straight back to their offices and write a report for the court that says just the opposite, and might well be even harder on the defendant than the original view, the one they insist they've been fully dissuaded from. And of course, there's no way of defending yourself from this. Something said in private is indeed in private, and it cannot be used in public. It's not something that makes it easy for the defense to keep those gentlemen's favor. On the other hand, it's also true that gentlemen don't become involved with the defense, which will of course be done with great expertise, just for philanthropic reasons or in order to be friendly. In some respect, it would be truer to say that they too have it allocated to them. Sorry, let me reread that because that just kind of confused me. On the other hand, it's also true that the gentlemen, meaning the officers of the court, don't become involved with the defense, which will of course be done with great expertise, just for philanthropic reasons, or in order to be friendly. In some respects, it would be truer to say that they too have it allocated to them. So if I'm understanding correctly, if it's allocated to them, it's like a duty given to them, right? So they actually it's something that they're told to do. Would I be misreading that?
Yeah. It's given to them.
Okay. Thank you. This is where the disadvantages of a court structure that, right from the start, stipulates that all proceedings take place in private come into force. In normal, mediocre trials, its officials have contact with the public, and they're very well equipped for it. But here they don't. Normal trials run their course all by themselves, almost, and just need a nudge here and there. But when they're faced with cases that are especially difficult, they're as lost as they often are with ones that are very simple. They're forced to spend all their time, day and night, with their laws, and so they don't have the right feel for human relationships, and that's a serious shortcoming in cases like this. That's when they come for advice to the lawyer, with a servant behind them carrying the documents which normally are kept so secret. You could have seen many gentlemen at this window, gentlemen of whom you would least expect it, staring out this window in despair on the street below while the lawyer is at his desk studying the documents so that he can give them good advice. And at times like that, it's also possible to see how exceptionally seriously these gentlemen take their professions and how they are thrown into great confusion by difficulties which it's not just in their natures to overcome. But they're not in an easy position. To regard their positions as easy would be to do them an injustice. The different ranks and hierarchies of the court are endless, and even someone who knows his way around them cannot always tell what's going to happen. But even for the junior officials, the proceedings in the courtrooms are usually kept secret, so they are hardly able to see how the cases they work with proceed. Court affairs appear in the range of vision often without their knowing where they come from, and they move on further without their learning where they go. So civil servants like this are not able to learn the things you can learn from studying the successive stages that individual trials go through, the final verdict, or the reasons for it. They're only allowed to deal with that part of the trial which the law allocates them, and they usually know less about the results of their work after it's left them than the defense does, even though the defense will usually stay in contact with the accused until the trial is nearly at its end, so that the court officials can learn many useful things from the defense. Bearing all this in mind, does it still surprise Kay that the officials are irritated and often express themselves about the litigants in unflattering ways, which is an experience shared by everyone. All the officials are irritated, even when they appear calm. This causes many difficulties for the junior advocates, of course. There is a story, for instance, that has very much the ring of truth about it. It goes like this. One of the older officials, a good and peaceful man, was dealing with a difficult matter for the court which had become very confused, especially thanks to the contributions from the lawyers. He had been studying it for a day and a night without a break, as these officials are indeed hard-working. No one works as hard as they do. When it was nearly morning and he had been working for 24 hours with probably very little result, he went to the front entrance, waited there in ambush, and every time a lawyer tried to enter the building, he would throw him down the steps. The lawyers gathered together down in front of the steps and discussed with each other what they should do. On the one hand, they had actually no right to be allowed into the buildings, so that there was hardly anything they could legally do to the official, and as I've already mentioned, they would have to be careful not to set all the officials against him. On the other hand, any day not spent in court is a day lost for them, and it was a matter of some importance to force their way inside. In the end, they agreed that they would try to tire the old man out. One lawyer after another was sent out to run up the steps and let himself be thrown down again, offering what resistance he could, as long as it was passive resistance, and his colleagues would catch him at the bottom of the steps. That went on for about an hour until the old gentleman, who was already exhausted from working all night, was very tired and went back to his office. Those who were at the bottom of the steps could not believe it at first, so they sent somebody out to go and look behind the door to see if there really was no one there. And only then did they all gather together, and probably didn't even dare to complain, as it's far from being the lawyer's job to introduce any improvement in the court system, or even to want to. Even the most junior lawyer can understand the relationship there to some extent, but one significant point is that almost every defendant, even very simple people, begins to think of suggestions for improving the court as soon as his proceedings have begun. Many of them often even spend time and energy on the matter that could be spent far better elsewhere. The only right thing to do is to learn how to deal with the situation as it is, even if it were possible to improve any detail of it, which is anyway no more than superstitious nonsense. The best that they could achieve, although doing themselves incalculable harm in the process, is that they will have attracted the special attention of the officials for any case that comes up in the future, and the officials are always ready to seek revenge. Never attract attention to yourself. Stay calm, however much it goes against your character. Try to gain some insight into the size of the court organism and how, to some extent, it remains in a state of suspension, and that even if you alter something in one place, you'll draw the ground out from under your feet and might fall, whereas if an enormous organism like the court is disrupted in any one place, it finds it easy to provide a substitute for itself somewhere else. Everything is connected with everything else and will continue without any change or else, which is quite probable, even more closed, more attentive, more strict, more malevolent. So it's best to leave the work to the lawyers and not to keep disturbing them. It doesn't do good to make accusations, especially if you can't make it clear what they're based on and their full significance. But it must be said that Kay caused a great deal of harm to his own case by his endeavor towards the office director. He was a very influential man, but now he might as well be struck off the list of those who might do anything for Kay. If the trial is mentioned, even just in passing, it's quite obvious that he's ignoring it. These officials are in many ways just like children. Often, something quite harmless, although Kay's behavior could unfortunately not be called harmless, will leave them feeling so offended that they will even stop talking with good friends of theirs. They turn away when they see them and do everything they can to oppose them. But then, with no particular reason, surprisingly enough, some little joke that was only ever attempted because everything seemed so hopeless will make them laugh and they'll be reconciled. It's both difficult and hard at the same time to deal with them, and there's hardly any reason for it. It's sometimes quite astonishing that a single, average life is enough to encompass so much that it's at all possible ever to have any success in one's work here. On the other hand, there are also dark moments, such as everyone has, when you think you've achieved nothing at all, and when it seems that the only trials to come to a good end are those that were determined to have a good end from the start and would do so without any help, while all the others are lost despite all the running to and fro, all the effort, all the little apparent successes that gave such joy. Then you no longer feel very sure of anything, and if asked about a trial that was doing well by its own nature, but which was turned for the worse because you assisted in it, would not even dare deny it. And even that is a kind of self-confidence, but then it's the only one that's left. Lawyers are especially vulnerable to fits of depression of that sort, and they are no more than fits of depression, of course, when a case is suddenly taken out of their hands after they've been conducting it satisfactorily for some time. That's probably the worst that can happen to a lawyer. It's not that the accused takes the case away from him. That hardly ever happens. Once a defendant has taken on a certain lawyer, he has to stay with him, whatever happens. How could he ever carry on by himself after he's taken on help from a lawyer? No, that just doesn't happen. But what does sometimes happen is that the trial takes on a course where the lawyer may not go along with it. Client and trial are both simply taken away from the lawyer, and then even contact with the court officials won't help, however good they are, as they don't know anything themselves. The trial will have entered a stage where no more help can be given, where it's being processed in courts to which no one has any access, where the defendant cannot even be contacted by his lawyer. You come home one day and find all the documents you submitted, which you worked hard to create, and which you had the best hopes for, lying on the desk. They've been sent back as they can't be carried through to the next stage in the trial. They're just worthless scraps of paper. It doesn't mean that the case has been lost, not at all, or at least there is no decisive reason for supposing so. It's just that you don't know anything more about the case and won't be told anything of what's happening. Well, cases like that are the exceptions, I'm glad to say, and even if case trial is one of them, it's still, for the time being, a long way off. But there was still plenty of opportunity for lawyers to get to work, and Kay could be sure they would be made use of. As he had said, the time for submitting documents was still in the future, and there was no rush to prepare them. It was much more important to start the initial discussions with the appropriate officials, and they had already taken place. With varying degrees of success, it must be said. It was much better not to give away any details before their time, as in that way Kay could only be influenced unfavorably, and his hopes might be raised or he might be made too anxious. Better just to say that some individuals have spoken very favorably and shown themselves very willing to help, although others have spoken less favorably, but even they have not in any way refused to help. So all in all, the results are very encouraging. Only, you should certainly not draw any particular conclusions, as all preliminary proceedings begin in the same way, and it was only the way they developed further that would show what the value of these preliminary proceedings has been. Anyway, nothing has been lost yet, and if we can succeed in getting the office director, despite everything, on our side, and several actions have been undertaken to this end, then everything is a clean wound, as a surgeon would say, and we can wait for the results with some comfort.
That was a lot.
That was a lot.
Okay, first of all, I have to mention, it's funny that the narrator is becoming interested now. Like, we're seeing first-person pronouns now. Like I and we, which we were not seeing before.
Yeah, I noticed that too. I had not noticed that ever before because I was listening to it. You can't pay that much attention when you're listening, especially when you're doing that work. Very interesting. This is the major section in which people get the idea that the court is one giant bureaucratic runaround. It's this section here. Now, it is clear as daylight why then people get that interpretation from this passage alone. I think, though, with the rest of the story, that doesn't quite make sense. One thing we do find out here is already the lawyers are not recognized in the part of the legal process. Sorry about that. Where's it going? Yeah, the lawyers are not part of the legal process, technically, and that the court, at least in its official capacity, despises them. They give them a really shitty room. They don't even allow them to do anything to fix it up themselves. To me, this is not something you can understand properly as a political metaphor or anything. This is a theological and a religious metaphor. The lawyers are, us in this group, I think we can all guess who the lawyers represent. The priests. The priesthood. Right. The ones who intercede on your behalf with God or whatever the divine is.
Without being asked to.
Yeah. The court doesn't appoint lawyers. The court doesn't recognize lawyers. But there are people who call themselves lawyers, and they're like, "Hey, I'll deal with the court for you," and that's what they do. So, as we can see, nowhere here do the lawyers deal with the courts directly, ever. They deal with the people who staff the courts, but they don't deal with the courts and the process directly at all. Here, I think the thing about like how their necessity is a bit of from the perspective of Kay, and is a bit of a ruse. Right. But not entirely a ruse. Because like the lawyers clearly have a real function, even though they're not part of the legal process openly. They are able to get in behind the things. But it's not the getting behind things, because in this passage we were already told apparently nothing that the lawyers do, nothing that anybody does, has any bearing on what the court eventually judges anyhow. Mm-hmm. Nobody has any reason to believe that the lawyers are efficacious. But since they see that people take on lawyers, and they feel themselves incapable of dealing with the courts themselves, and don't know how to deal with the process, they just assume that they need somebody like that. And to me, the most important thing is the assumption that the process itself, as this formality in the metaphor of legality here, is the important thing. That is the completely wrong assumption on the part of the accused. My main reason for this goes straight back to chapter 1 and a few other places in the other chapters that we read, where Kay has been told that the nature of this trial has to do with him, who he is. And they told him, don't worry about the courts, stop worrying about like what will happen, worry about yourself. And when people get engaged with the lawyers, this is the problem that is exacerbated to an extreme. They become the lawyers themselves, because they are lawyers, are enthralled and are captivated by the idea of the process itself, the formal process. They're the ones who suss out rules and deal with rules. Of course, they don't know any rules. They don't know because the court never deals with them directly. The defendants don't know any rules because the court doesn't think it's anything worthwhile to tell the defendants anything, the accused, anything on this matter. Because indeed, if it's about who you are, and the question is the trial of what kind of person you are, it's no good for the courts. And I'm not saying this in the court as an adversarial against a person. It's no good for the very possibility of a genuine judgment. You know, if it's like the trial of getting somebody to fall in love with you. If, you know, the way that you deal with a love relationship, a romance, is that you try to get behind the back of the person and sneak around and try to find out what this person likes, and then you then say, aha, I'm going to beat this trial by then presenting myself because I've cheated and I've found out behind their backs, you know, what it is that, you know, they dig, and I'm going to lie to this person so that they like me. That's basically what this would amount to in this court. So obviously the court has no interest whatsoever in letting you do that. Why would it let you do that? It would defeat the entire purpose of the trial. The thing of that nobody knows how to influence the court, in that it seems that the game that the lawyers and that the people who go with the lawyers get stuck with is precisely this game of how do you influence the court, because they think it's they think, I mean, this reminds me of like a lot of funny things. It's like what is it? In the U.S. there's something called the sovereign, or there was something. I don't know. It seems to kind of have died down.
It's still around.
The sovereign citizen movement, for whom the idea of the law is that if you just state things and formulate things linguistically in the right way, you can beat the courts. But this is not at all how things work. This is not at all how actual law operates. Even if you could catch them on verbal and written contradictions, that's not really ultimately how the courts run themselves. There's plenty of leeway in which they bend the words. And you know, it's even more to the advantage of this court, for whom there are no public words whatsoever for you to catch them on a contradiction, if there even could be any. I mean, like, as I said, if the trial is indeed about you, the contradiction is not going to be with the courts. The contradiction is going to be with you. So I think this long passages where we find out it's useless. It is at face useless to try to influence the court.
Well, what the part of it that I really liked was where they mentioned, you know, these court officials might, you might be conversing with them, and in private conversation, it seems like they take your perspective, and they see the other perspective is wrong. They're like, oh, actually the defendant is right, and it means nothing. You still lose the trial. Which is, like, it's Job, like we brought up. God says
yes.
to Job, you're a good and righteous man, you did everything right. Cool, I don't care.
No, yeah, but then again, you could also interpret this more favorably, I think, in that since the job of the court is mainly to observe, when you actually meet the officials, they're probably not going to contradict you very much. They're just probably going to egg you on to see where you're going, and to see where you're coming from. So of course, most defendants and most lawyers would see, we got them on our pocket. When the complete opposite is the case, I mean, they'd be like, they'd have a nice conversation with you. It's like I mean, people actually do this. Some people who have, I think, could make better use of their times, but I am not one to judge. I can't make that judgment for them. People who go and just say what is it that a Nazi actually thinks, and if you actually want to know this, and you actually want to get what they genuinely think, just let them talk. You just let them talk, and you go, oh, okay, yeah, and, they give you this is this and this is that, and you're like, oh, yeah, okay. And they're like, and according to this, if this is the case, then this follows. You're like, yeah, right. And you could completely believe that, and you know that this person is completely insane. That this person has a completely fucked up view of the world, that they're wrong. So, these could be deceptions which are not intended as deceptions at all. It's just people hang themselves. It's their fault for talking. It's there's that famous video on YouTube of this one lawyer from the U.S. The one who says don't ever talk to the police. It's never going to help you ever. Don't talk to the prosecution. It will never help you.
But also, this isn't about the law specifically, even though, it's a fitting metaphor.
Logos means law as well.
Yeah, but, what I mean is, in terms of the speaking thing, God always knows what you're thinking, right?
Yeah, that's why all these meetings are in private, Josh.
Yes.
Because if you're in public, you put on a face, but in private, and when you really think you're in private, that's when you open up as to who you really are. And especially if you think somebody's favorable to who you really are. So the fact that the court operates in total secrecy, everything is private, is completely logical to the point of the trial. Another thing here that's interesting is the issue of improving the courts, and that this is a bad idea. This goes straight back to chapter 2 and chapter 3, where, particularly in chapter 3, where the washerwoman, the wife of the usher, the court usher, she wants to help Kay because Kay had lied that he had done his stump speech in chapter 2, accusing the court of being a sham, of being terrible and crummy, and that he wanted to, he did that to stand up for all the people who were falsely accused, just like he was. And so the woman asks him, if you're serious, are you serious about improving things around here? They're so awful. And Kay's a selfish bastard, and he's like, oh well, well, yes, now that I'm in the trial, if it's something I could do upon my way, and it's not going to inconvenience me, and I can tell that you might help me if I help you, sure, I might improve things around here. And, at face, you'd be like, oh, well, at least that'd be a nice thing, right, to improve things. But what we're told here is that it's not clear that improvements actually improve anything. That it's not in your favor to try to improve the court in any way, because the court is just this massive, sprawling organism in which you don't understand its logic. You don't understand how it operates. So even if you might be obstinate and want to fix just one thing, your lack of understanding of the context might just mean that you've ruined something. And that does not reflect well on you. Now that's an interesting point. Because that's a pretty quietistic point on the side of religion, and usually it is kind of what religions, as far as I'm aware, every religion has at least one denomination, one strand of interpretation which leads exactly to that view, that it's best to do nothing, to try to improve nothing, because you don't know how everything works. You're not God. So, you think you're improving things, but you might actually be fucking things up. Let me see where that is at. Okay, yeah, that's top of page 65. Even the most junior lawyer can understand the relationship there to some extent, but one significant point is that almost every defendant, even very simple people, begins to think of suggestions for improving the court as soon as his proceedings have begun. Many of them often even spend time and energy on the matter that could be spent far better elsewhere. The only right thing to do is to learn how to deal with the situation as it is, even if it were possible to improve any detail of it, which is anyway no more than superstitious nonsense. The best that they could achieve, although doing themselves incalculable harm in the process, comes up in the future, and the officials are always ready to seek revenge. So that is interesting. Now there's a way in which I think this can be coherently defended. I mean, there's many ways in which good intentions, because they're ignorant, lead to bad results. It's pretty empirically known. Plenty of things happen all the time. I think everybody knows at moments in their own life and moments of people around in their lives where somebody tries to improve something without knowing the full context of things, and they just make it worse. There are other cases, though, in which it's not clear at all that the improvement would have any negative consequence, or that, particularly it was a solution to a problem that didn't quite exist. And where initially it will have terrible consequences, but in the long run, in the deeper sense, it would actually be a good. This is where a kind of logic which is not normal, which I assume that it's very few standpoints have this. I think Hegelianism is the only one that I'm explicitly aware that has this, which is that in Hegel, the acceptance of the possibility and reality of evil as a moment of the good is fully expected and acceptable, that there are good things that initially must appear extremely bad. The major example for that is particularly with the human individual in the development of a personality. That as children grow, there is a moment in which children must experience discomfort, displeasure, oppression, in having to control desires and having to control impulses. And that initially this is experienced indeed as a violence. to the self. But this is a necessary violence, because if you can master that moment, it becomes a supremely solid building block for the rest of a very important set of ways in which a person can develop. If you didn't undergo that, you are in a lot of trouble, because avoiding that initial pain, sharp and short as it may be, only leads to, in the long term, far more pain, far more problems.
Think about all the people who weren't disciplined at all. Not physically necessarily, but just weren't limited really in any way. Weren't told, oh, what you're doing is wrong. You gotta not do that. There's some pretty messed up people out there. I'm not saying it's 100% every time, but there's a lot to suggest that people don't learn these on their own, like to moderate their behavior, to modulate their behavior.
And this is something that is probably true for Jewish tradition as well as Christian. Well, I think it's true for at least the Jewish tradition and the Christian tradition. For example, with capitalism, Marx is a famous critic of capitalism, but Marx sees capitalism as a necessary evil. What is the famous phrase that you love, Hyperion? The blood god. Progress is...
Oh, yeah. Progress is a hideous god who drinks from the skulls of the slain. The nectar, a sweet nectar from the skulls of the slain. It's about how, to progress, not necessarily horrific things, you have to do horrific things, but horrific things will happen. And, but progress is made. And he advanced... he wanted the advance of capitalism in Germany because he thought it would hasten communism. His idea of communism, of course, not, for anyone listening, they should read Marx for himself if you haven't. Not just assume you know what communism is. That's what he wanted, because it wasn't.
So, for all the terrible things, everybody who looks at the development of modern society economically, it was a nightmare. It was horrible. It was inhuman. But objectively speaking, we had to go through that inhumanity to get to the point where we could free ourselves more, from the factory slavery, the slavery of factory works. Being cogs in the machine. Today we're still cogs in the machine, but of a different nature, for a large part.
Different kind.
And it had to happen. In the same way in China. China for the last, up until about the turn of about 2008 onwards, and really just even before that, slightly before that, but about 2000. Was the sweatshop of the world, and everybody's heard the horror stories of people working in Chinese factories, and they're real. Not every factory was to that extent, but it was a real thing. And I've seen some documentaries of people talking about that time with their parents. It was just terrible. Just so much human spirit was sacrificed. So many people just slaved away at work their entire lives, but it paid off. That those factories led to the development of things other than factories, and made the capacity for China to become what it is today. Which, for any of you who still believe that China is like the factory of the world, I don't know, watch some YouTube videos or something, because you could literally watch videos. China is just so different than people think nowadays. So anyway, so this idea that maybe the obsession with trying to fix things is not necessarily a good idea. It's a mistaken idea. But as already noted, nobody knows how the court works. So nobody can tell you that's necessarily a bad idea, just that, at least insofar as the narrator is telling us, it usually ends up being a bad idea. And the reason is pretty obvious. People are ignorant of the process of the court and how the court works, and they're assuming things. So they're messing with something that's already established, has its own rhythm, and yeah. What was another thing I noticed scrolling down is the idea that the court itself is the one that kind of like makes use of the lawyers, because the court officials are so far from the regular populace.
Mm-hmm.
CK, what was it? Let's see. In normal mediocre trials, these officials have contact with the public and they're very well equipped for it. But here they don't. Normal trials run their course all by themselves, almost, and just need a nudge here and there. But when they're faced with cases that are especially difficult, they're as lost as they often are with ones that are very simple. They're forced to spend all their time day and night with their laws, and so they don't have the right feel for human relationships. And that's a serious shortcoming in cases like this. That's when they come for advice to the lawyers, with a servant behind them carrying documents which normally are kept secret. You could have seen many gentlemen at this window, gentlemen of whom you would at least expect it, staring out this window in despair on the street below, where the lawyer is at his desk studying the documents so that he can give them good advice. And at times like that, it's also possible to see how exceptionally seriously these gentlemen take their professions, and how they are thrown into great confusion by difficulties, which is just not in their natures to overcome. But they're not in an easy position to regard the positions as easy to do them injustice. The different ranks and hierarchies of the court are endless, and even someone who knows his way around them cannot always tell what's going to happen. So this thing about the court officials seeking out the lawyers themselves to try to help out with the trial. Now notice that this is just fucking bizarre. In a normal trial, the issue is with, well, the relationship of the defendant to the law. Why would they go to a lawyer? That's for advice. That just seems weird. Now, though, what makes sense to me, and what makes sense with the rest of what's going on in the story implicitly, as well as sometimes explicitly, I think, is that this is another ploy by the court to try to help people. Okay, you don't want to deal with a trial by yourself. You think you need a priest. You think you need a religion. So sometimes the court goes and actually talks to the priest, gives them information that might be helpful to you, so that you can get you through your trial. And indeed, I mean, as you see in real life, sometimes people just fall on hard times, and they seek out religion. They feel they have nowhere else to go, and some of them certainly find help in religion. It fixes up their life. They manage to find their strength there. They manage to find some answers that they needed there, and they can finally fix things up.
Yep.
Other section right after that is about how no court official knows the entirety of the trial. So the people who end up knowing more about the trial overall is, one, they accuse themselves because they're there for it all the way, and the lawyers. But the lawyers only know by second hand. The lawyers don't know directly from the courts. Nobody knows directly from the courts because the court doesn't communicate back down until the judgment is given. So even with the lawyers, a lot of what the lawyers do is just clearly useless. They can't influence anyone. They can't learn directly about what the court's nature is. It's mentioned in this section a few times that all the lawyers end up knowing is hearsay. Either hearsay from the officials themselves, who in private conversations don't have any necessity to be telling truths or to divulge any information whatsoever, or once you know that they only deal with a certain portion of the trial for a certain amount of time, why would you expect that they would know anything about the greater generalities of the court is beyond me. So the accused knows little to nothing. The lawyers seem to know more only on the level of a superficial formality. Beyond that, they don't actually know anything either. All they ever really do is exactly how it's being said here. They can influence people. Mm-hmm. That's it. Like they don't know how. They actually don't influence the trial as far as they can tell. And if they ever influence the trial, they never know. This has been said multiple times already. That there is.
The defense doesn't matter.
Yeah, the defense doesn't matter, and that the trials that end well were always going to end well.
Yep.
And the trials that end bad were always going to end bad. But here we were also told that because this is the case does not also then mean that you don't assume that your trial is going to be one of those. So you have to do something.
Right.
You can't do anything to help your trial on the level of formality, but you ought to do something for your trial. And I think this is not a contradiction at all. It's only a contradiction for the defendants who take this to be about the formality of the trial itself. The courts themselves do not matter. The people who obsess with the courts are completely in the wrong. They misunderstand. That the deal is not to deal with the courts at all. The whole legality process is not what it's about at all. It's at least with spiritual gurus, this is the case. Spiritual teachers, not just gurus, not Indian, but from pretty much all walks of all religions, people who reach that level and that kind of mystical understanding, all of them say basically the same thing. It's not about the rules. It never was about the rules. It's not about like the Bible or the Quran or the Bhagavad Gita or anything like that. It's not about like, oh, well, the book says this, so I'm going to have to do this. It's not about that at all. It's about a personal relationship to truth, a personal relationship to God. And you could be doing things that, according to the book, are wrong. Mm-hmm. But if you do them for the right reasons, you're not guilty. I think I don't know if I mentioned this last time. I know we talked about it, but I forget if I mentioned the ones about the Casey example. I don't think I mentioned it on the recording.
The recording.
Yeah. There's a mystic, famous mystic. If you've never heard him, actually look him up. Very interesting. Named Edward Casey.
Edgar.
Edgar. Yeah, Edgar Casey. There's a famous, well, not famous. It's famous to me because I've heard it a few times, but but it's one of my favorite sermons. He used to give life readings, which is just kind of like past life readings, but as well as like the nature of certain things going on in your life. Mystic psychic. And there's two cases that stick in my mind because they juxtapose extremely well to this issue. A young girl comes to him. She's having issues in her life. I think she's like about a 15-year-old girl or something. Mind you, this is back in like the 1950s, 40s.
Yeah.
That milieu, that time and that culture, and she was depressed. She was having a hard time because at school she was bullied, and not just at school, but just generally. People in her age disliked her. And as far as she could tell, she hadn't done anything. She was a good Christian-going girl, typical, well, I don't know if she was well-to-do. Well, I think most people kind of went to Casey were kind of a bit well-to-do, but not rich, but they had a bit of money. Although Casey also just kind of offered help to anybody for whatever, even if they couldn't pay. And she was particularly called a whore. And she's like, I don't understand why they keep telling me that. So Casey does his thing, and he's like, well, I'll tell you why. And he reveals to her that in a prior life, she was a whore. Particularly a gold digger. And she used her sexuality to appeal.
Gold digger. Like a, is that what you said, gold digger?
Yeah, gold digger.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, just let me check my thing. Okay, it's still recording, so just probably Discord. So she was a gold digger, or at least that's what's implied. She used her sex appeal to manipulate people, and for personal ends.
In a prior lifetime.
Yeah, and so this time, because she hurt a lot of people with this, it was karma coming back in a different way. So though obviously she's a 15-year-old girl, and she's a typical prudish 1940s, 50s American girl. That's why that was happening. And you might, if you, at the face of it, on the Christian interpretation, you might say, well, that's what you get for being a whore. Well, here's what shows that this isn't the case. There's another story of this is all like a grandma already, like an old woman. Comes in with her family, they all kind of get the life reading, and she gets one, and she has a good life and all these other things, and she finds out that in her prior life, she too was a whore. Except
now, by whore here he means prostitute.
Prostitute, yeah.
Yeah. There are different connotations, but yeah.
Yeah. So. But her life was pretty great. It was pretty slow. In fact, she was told that was going to be her last reincarnation, if she wanted it to be. Because she had kind of accomplished what a good person is what a person is supposed to accomplish, which is to learn the lessons of how to be a good person. So in her prior life, she was a prostitute, but she wasn't selfish about it. They don't describe what it is that she did exactly. But it said that she did she did this in a loving manner out of compassion for her clients.
She comforted clients.
Yeah. And it wasn't out of just, gold digging or whatever. So this goes back to, that famous phrase from Jesus. What is it? It's the one about, somebody asked him about, is it okay to eat pork or not? Because the law says it's, what's the word? I know, some things are called abominations. I forget what this is called, sinful, whatever. And Jesus says it's not what matters, it's not what goes into your mouth that matters. It's what comes out of it. At least that's my paraphrase of what I'm remembering. I'm not exactly sure what exactly the phrase is. I should probably look it up.
Not that which goeth into the mouth defileth the man, but that which cometh out of the mouth, this defileth the man. Matthew 15:11.
Yeah. So what I analogize to that is, it's not the thing itself that is sinful. It's a bit of a Kantian thing. It's the attitude and intent behind it ultimately that matters more. So if you try to improve the court, but for the right reasons, you're probably not going to be guilty on that account. They're not going to hold it against you. Now, the petty officials might hold it against you, but it's not they who hand out the final judgment. This is made clear. Because it's made clear later on, in this very chapter, that indeed there are times in which you will be acquitted by the lower courts, but that this means jack shit. because it's not the lower courts that have the final decision. Which is goes yet again with the whole idea of structural religion, what's the institutionalized religion, which is your priest might think you're a good person, and your priest may give their word that you're a good person. Your religion might say you're a good person. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter.
And the inverse is true.
Indeed. If you are not guilty, it doesn't mean necessarily that you won't be put on trial. So if you're innocent, you still can be put on trial. Now you won't be given a condemnation, but your trial may still be a real shit show for you. And nobody on the lower courts ever truly, fully knows what the higher court's judgment is. Until the very end. And even then, the lower courts and the lawyers never find out. You find out, but nobody else does.
The truth is the whole, as Hegel said. And they don't know the whole. So.
Yep. What do you think about that? Oh, yeah, he went to sleep. Never mind.
Oh, Josh, yeah.
We'll get his opinion later. How long have we been going? 1 hour.
So, Zoroastrianism has this idea, Zarathustra, Zoroaster. The idea is that one ought to have good thoughts, good words, and good deeds. And Kay has neither good thoughts, good words, nor good deeds.
Indeed. All right, let's move on.
Oh,
when you start talking, or if you wanted to expand on that, go ahead.
Oh, no.
Okay.
I didn't know we were going to continue. I still have it open, though. I scrolled back down.
Yeah, we're on bottom 66. When he started talking on in this way, the lawyer was quite tireless. He went through it all again every time Kay went to see him. There was always some progress, but he could never be told what sort of progress it was. The first set of documents to be submitted were being worked on, but still not ready, which usually turned out to be a great advantage the next time Kay went to see him, as the earlier occasion would have been a very bad time to put them in, which they could not then have known. If Kay, stupefied from all this talking, ever pointed out that, even considering all these difficulties, progress was very slow, the lawyer would object that progress was not slow at all, but that they might have progressed far further if Kay had come to him at the right time. But he had come to him late, and that lateness would bring still further difficulties, and not only where time was concerned. The only welcome interruption during these visits was always when Lenny contrived to bring the lawyer his tea while Kay was there. Then she would stand behind Kay, pretending to watch the lawyer as he bent greedily over his cup, poured the tea in and drank, and secretly let Kay hold her hand. There was always complete silence. The lawyer drank. Kay squeezed Lenny's hand, and Lenny would sometimes dare to gently stroke Kay's hair. Still here, are you? The lawyer would ask when he was ready. I wanted to take the dishes away, said Lenny. They would give each other's hands a final squeeze, and the lawyer would wipe his mouth and then start talking at Kay again with renewed energy. Just note that Kay doesn't ask any questions. It's already been stated by him that as far as Kay's concerned, he doesn't think that he needs to ask any questions, because he already assumes the lawyer knows nothing, and that anything that the lawyer could know about what the right questions are to ask to the court, Kay already assumes he knows what questions are the proper ones and that he'll do it himself. So instead, he just spends time, playing with the hands with Lenny. Literally some hanky-panky.
Mm-hmm. Getting handsy. But, notice it says then start talking at Kay again, not to him. When you're talked to at, that implies you're not listening.
Yeah. Not only that, I mean, it's no, that's a very good point. It's also not clear that the lawyer would particularly listen to Kay or care that much anyhow. I'm not saying he doesn't care about the case or not care about Kay, but the way he relates to Kay, it'd be like you preaching at your preacher. They wouldn't probably care for that. And insofar as the preacher preaches, it's kind of to a general audience about stuff. And a lot of the stuff that's Kay's been talking about just seems to be general information which would be applicable to any defendant, not particularly to him. So, continuing. Was the lawyer trying to comfort Kay or to confuse him? Kay could not tell, but it seemed clear to him that his defense was not in good hands. Maybe everything the lawyer said was quite right, even though he obviously wanted to make himself as conspicuous as possible, and probably have never even taken on a case as important as he said Kay's was. But it was still suspicious how he continually mentioned his personal contacts with the civil servants. Were they to be exploited solely for Kay's benefit? The lawyer never forgot to mention that they were dealing only with junior officials, which meant officials who were dependent on others, and the direction taken in each trial could be important for their own furtherment. Could it be that they were making use of the lawyer to turn trials in a certain direction, which would, of course, always be at the cost of the defendant? It certainly did not mean that they would do that in every trial. That was not likely at all. And there were probably also trials where they gave the lawyer advantages and also the room he needed to turn it in the direction he wanted, as it would also be to their advantage to keep his reputation intact. If that really was the relationship, how could they direct Kay's trial, which, as the lawyer had explained, was especially difficult and therefore important enough to attract great attention from the very first time it came to court? There could not be much doubt about what they would do. The first signs of it could already be seen in the fact that the first document still had not been submitted, even though the trial had already lasted several months, and that according to the lawyer, everything was still in its initial stages, which was very effective, of course, in making the defendant passive and keeping him helpless. Then he could be suddenly surprised with a verdict, or at least with a notification that the hearing had not decided in his favor and the matter would be passed on to a higher office. It was essential that Kay take a hand in it himself. On winter's mornings such as this, when he was very tired and everything dragged itself lethargically through his head, this belief of his seemed irrefutable. He no longer felt that compelled for the trial that he had. Oh, sorry, I misread that.
Okay.
He no longer felt the contempt for the trial that he had earlier. If he had been alone in the world, it would have been easy for him to ignore it, although it was also certain that in that case, the trial would never have arisen in the first place. But now, his uncle had already dragged him to see the lawyer. He had to take account of his family. His job was no longer totally separate from the progress of the trial. He himself had carelessly, with a certain inexplicable complacency, mentioned it to acquaintances, and others had learned about it, and in ways he did not know. His relationship with Miss Burnster seemed to be in trouble because of it. In short, he no longer had any choice whether he would accept the trial or turn it down. He was in the middle of it and had to defend himself. If he was tired, then that was bad. So, some strange things here. He's losing his edge against the trial. He no longer feels contempt for it, as he had earlier. Now, this is a weird one. If he had been alone in the world, it would have been easy for him to ignore it, although it was also certain that in that case, the trial would never have arisen in the first place. I take this to be to me, it's clear. This is one of those clears of, if it wasn't for other people, I wouldn't have any problems.
Right.
which is a completely wrong view.
Mm-hmm.
This is the view of people who are like, oh, I don't want to make any personal relationships. I don't want to have any deep personal friends. All that stuff just drags you down. It just brings trials to you. That's when you're deepest within the trial. As with Kay. The fact that Kay even thinks this is already telling as to why he's in this trial. I mean, and then this is indeed curious. I mean, we've already seen that we haven't had an example, or nothing's been stated in the story so far that shows us that Kay has anybody in the world that he actually cares about, that he actually considers a friend, or that he genuinely loves.
Mm-hmm.
And he places such weird emphases of importance on the completely wrong things. I mean, like, for example, it says, this trial is, making his relationship, his relationship with Miss Bernster seemed to be in trouble because of the trial. He had no relationship with Miss Bernster. She lived next door. He never talked to her.
Right. She's legitimately concerned with him, but he doesn't seem concerned with her at all. Only in as much as she can do things for him.
Yeah, first she was going to go work for a lawyer. She could have helped him had he told her about it. He didn't want to tell her about it? Okay. Then he basically fucking molested her. And then she had a friend tell him straight up what the issue was, and that, that he should learn to, that once he has made an error, sometimes it's best to just, move on. You can't fix it, but make sure that you don't do it again. Improve yourself as a person. See your error and accept it. He didn't do that either. So... jumping back to the very beginning of this chapter, he was thinking about submitting the first documents. Documents which, by the way, the court never asked anybody. The court hasn't asked him all the information, all the talking he does with regards to the courts is stuff they didn't ask for. So consider that. Consider that you're dealing with a quote-unquote bureaucracy, so-called. And you're giving them work, which they didn't ask you to give them. The fact that the court then goes ahead and never looks at this stuff, as far as Kay is aware, is pretty obvious. I wouldn't look at that shit either. And especially when Kay's okay, maybe if I just try to think back throughout my entire life and look at all and literally write his own biography and go through all the things he's ever done and judge for himself whether he thinks that's good or bad and why, and to give justification as to why he did it. Why would the court care? It's a waste. It's a giant waste of time for himself and for the court. Anyways, that's just wanted to say that before that got lost in my train of thought.
Yeah. There have been times in my life where I was like, oh boy, how could I justify that?
Indeed, there's times in my life in which I'm aware that I couldn't justify that. And to try to go to that person and apologize would not be a good idea. So the best I can do is I acknowledge the evil that I have done, and I certainly won't do it again.
Yeah.
So Let's continue. But there was no reason to worry too much before he needed to. He had been capable of working himself up to his high position in the bank in a relatively short time, and to retain it with respect from everyone. Now he simply had to apply some of the talents that made that possible for him to the trial, and there was no doubt that it had to turn out well. The most important thing, if something was to be achieved, was to reject in advance any idea that he might be in any way guilty. There was no guilt. The trial was nothing but a big piece of business, just like he had already concluded to the benefit of the bank many times, a piece of business that concealed many lurking dangers waiting in ambush for him, as they usually did, and these dangers would need to be defended against. If that was to be achieved, then he must not entertain any idea of guilt. Whatever he did, he would need to look after his own interests as closely as he could. Now, see, in a regular court of law, this would be a good strategy. Because in a regular court of law, the whole thing is just to give the best case possible for yourself while it's admitting nothing at all as to what you are being indicted for. This is why lawyers go ahead and make the most ridiculous cases on behalf of their clients, because that's just the way that it is. In this court, you can't do that. It's about you. Something I don't think I mentioned this before. This goes back, I think, all the way to chapter 1. Actually, probably chapter 2. Kay assumes, and it is implied heavily in my understanding, that this is not the case. He assumes that he's where he's at all because of himself, that he's a purely self-made man. I think the fact that once you find out who his uncle is, this should be straight out of your mind. It's very clear that Kay is not here because of his skills. In fact, as we can tell, he's terrible. He's terrible at dealing with people. He is not a sociable person. He doesn't have a good personality, a good character. He doesn't seem like a good problem solver. He's probably got his position because of nepotism more than anything.
Right, he's an entitled person.
So the trial was nothing but a big piece of business. I've already said that. If that was to be achievable, then he must not entertain any idea of guilt, whatever he did. He would need to look after his own interests as closely as he could. Seen in this way, there was no choice but to take his representation away from the lawyer very soon, at best that very evening. The lawyer had told him, as he talked to him, that was something unheard of, and would probably do him a great deal of harm, but Kay could not tolerate any impediment to his efforts where his trial was concerned, and these impediments were probably caused by the lawyer himself. But once he had shaken off the lawyer, the documents would need to be resubmitted straight away, and if possible, he would need to see to it that they were being dealt with every day. It would of course not be enough, if that was to be done, for Kay to sit in the corridor with his hat under the bench like the others. Day after day, he himself, or one of the women, or somebody else, on his behalf, would have to run after the officials and force them to sit at their desks and study Kay's documents instead of looking out on the corridor through the grating. There could be no let-up in these efforts. Everything would need to be organized and supervised. It was about time that the court came up against a defendant who knew how to defend and make use of his rights. Another interesting thing, Kay's mentioned that, I got all these women I'm attracting myself to help me. All of them have told him they can't help him. They first offer help. He refuses the help they could actually give. And then afterwards, they're like, well, that's about all we can do. He was, the washerwoman didn't tell him that, but it was kind of pretty clear that, she was in with the court. So, how she could help him, especially after, he attacked the student. And when he did that, she told him, you're ruining everything. You don't do that. He still did it anyways. So it seems she didn't want any contact any further. And there has been, as far as the story is concerned, as we're let know, no further contact. So why? Lenny has already also told him that there is no winning against the court. You have to admit your guilt, and only then would you get through the trial. Now he's adamant that he's not guilty. She even told him what he's guilty of, that he's stubborn to an extreme degree. And he's like, well, I like being stubborn. And and he's like, can you really not help me, if I don't do this? And Lenny told him straight up, no, there's nothing I can do. So why he is still assuming that they're going to help him is beyond me. Second, he knows nothing about this court. This is not the first time we mentioned this. He knows nothing about this court. And he's assuming that he's going to deal personally with them. Mm-hmm. He's just going to annoy the court every single day. That'll show them. Yeah, that'll show them. The thing about the releasing the lawyer, it's already been mentioned that lawyers do lose cases, not because the accused lets go of the lawyer, but because the court takes the case away to somebody else or to a higher court, and then the lawyer just doesn't know. And the lawyers never quite know whether what they did was ultimately useful for the trial or not. So that's an interesting one. It's said that it's very, very rare for somebody to release their lawyer and deal with the court themselves.
Right.
Now, it's implied that this is bad. But it's implied that it's bad only after the fact that you've taken on a lawyer. If you never took on a lawyer, it's not a bad thing. At least that's how I interpret it. If you never fall for the trap of the lawyers, if you never fall for the trap of getting caught up in trying to find out the useless things about the structure of the court itself, as if that matters, then that's not a mistake. But if you take up a lawyer to begin with, and you do so precisely on the misunderstanding that what matters is finding out what the court does so you can game it, and you get rid of your lawyer, who has far more experience than you, who's seen multiple defendants through, whose conclusions they don't quite know exactly, then you're an idiot.
Yeah, because you're putting it off onto another person, the lawyer, and then when it doesn't yield the result that you want, you get rid of them, and then you're at fault. Those who are ignorant are not culpable necessarily for their spiritual crimes, let's say, but those who know, gain knowledge, and then choose to use it unwisely, and then learn the truth and abstract from it and say, oh, I'm going to just do what I want rather than the truth, they're culpable. I mean, that's the analog that I take from this.
Yeah, I can see that. What I would add to that is it's a mistake that I think is epitomized by New Agery. You get what I mean?
Yeah, for sure.
That people who are in the New Age movement, who have those kind of spirituals, I consider them pseudo-spiritual views. They're not really spiritual views. It's under a mistaken view of what spirituality is. They're an analog to this. Okay, you get rid of the priests, because you realize that the priest doesn't actually know anything, or at least you assume so, because you don't know any more about the court than they do. So maybe they do know something, but you don't. But if you reject that for the wrong reasons, you're gonna end up in other bullshit that's not any closer to the truth. But you assume it, because now you're directly dealing with it. You assume that it has to have some kind of truth, because seeing is believing. Oh, I'm the one doing it, so I'm the one who can know. In this case, but no, not necessarily. People misperceive things all the time. Kay is misperceiving a lot of the process that's going on all this time. So even if he had any amount of small success, he would misunderstand what that success means. And as it's already been said, just like the good intentions of changing the court, there might be a deep misunderstanding that a success might actually be damning. The success is not the success one thinks it is.
Yeah, what does it matter if you pass a class or something and you don't learn anything?
What does it matter if you access the higher realms but you're possessed by Ahriman?
Right.
And
you glimpse the mysteries and misunderstand them.
Yep. And it happens all the fucking time.
All the time.
Which is, by the way, it is said all the time by religious institutions and works. It is true in a far deeper sense than what is said. In which they're like, oh, well, the devil can perform miracles too. So, miracles and the fact that you might say, oh, I want to get closer to God, and you start having mystical experiences. You're like, oh, now I see. The Christians have been lying to me all this time. The rabbis have been lying to me all this time. Indians have been lying to me this whole time. This is what the real God is. I've seen the real power. How do I know? Because I've seen the real power. You've seen a miracle. You've seen magic. That you possess. That's not proof of anything.
You saw lies from the Davis.
Exactly. The devil can make miracles too. So, a complete idiot can achieve something in court too. But that achievement in this court is not going to help it. Let me see. Let's see what the fan makes you. Okay. But when Kay had the confidence of trying to do all this, the difficulty of composing documents was too much for him. Earlier, just a week or so before, he could only have felt shame at the thought of being made to write out such documents himself. It had never entered his head that the task could also be difficult. He remembered one morning when, already piled up with work, he suddenly shoved everything to one side and took a pad of paper on which he sketched out some of his thoughts on how the document of this sort should proceed, because he could offer them to that slow-witted lawyer. Perhaps he could offer them to that slow-witted lawyer, but just then the door of the manager's office opened and the deputy director entered the room with a loud laugh. Kay was very embarrassed. Actually, let's leave it here, because this is where another little section begins. So another part of the chapter. It's the manufacture. So, okay. And we've been going on for an hour and a half. That's a pretty good one.
Mm-hmm.
So,
are we going to do fan mail? We got a message. Yeah. Alright, someone who's been watching says, I think AW is wrong about the book not being autobiographical. I think it probably is very much so, to a very painful extent. You should read the short story The Judgment, which maybe provides a key both in terms of the relationship with Kafka's parents, with how he lived a life of complete paralysis and fear, and how that is not unrelated to the deep theological significance which is the essence of this work.
Well, to that reader, I must say, the autobiographical reading of any artwork has to be the dumbest and most base interpretation you can give to an art. It is not worthy. I will say this outright. It is not worthy of being called an artistic interpretation. That's not how you interpret any artwork.
Right.
Now, I'm not like if you thought that what I meant is that this has nothing to do with Kafka's experiences, I'm well aware of that. I'm well aware of his relationship to his father. It was terrible. So certainly that plays out in this. But that's not the meaning of this book. If you make that the meaning, you're taking away the thing that actually makes this artistic. Art is universal. It's not about individuals.
Right. It's not about particular people. It's not about subjective spirit.
Indeed. I mean, if this was just about Kafka the person, it would be nowhere near as interesting, quite frankly. Plenty of people have fucked up lives.
Right.
But this is a message that anybody can learn from. I mean, I would hope, and I'm trying to give an explanation. I know I'm not the best explainer and speaker, but I'm trying to give a universal explanation towards which it's not only, just people like Kay. I hope that for anybody listening to this, they realize, it's been said already a few times, this is about all of us. To some extent, all of us are Kay. To some extent, all of us are committing some mistake, the likes of which Kay is committing. And we don't even know it. And the question of, like, how do you deal with that? You know, all of us are on trial. You know, we're on the trial of life. And the trial is not about, like, physically living or biologically living. You know, the trial isn't about, like, making your rent or whatever. No, the trial is about being a good person, learning how to be a good person. Because if life isn't about anything other than that. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, go on. You go ahead.
No, I said, because quite frankly, if life wasn't... yeah, it's okay. Quite frankly, if life was not about this, then life isn't about anything worthwhile. You know, if you don't think that it matters, what it is to... Because what it is to be a good person is deeply rooted and connected with the question of what it is to have a good life. And that question is deeply rooted in the question of what it is to be good, not just as a person, but in general, like literally just like for anything to be good, which is tied to the question of just what it is to be. Everything is tied with this. You know, making your rent, all these other things, the details of the trial, which is why this book, I think properly, never tells you what the details of the trial are. We see details, but you're supposed to catch on to them. You know, like I'm glad that Kafka doesn't spell it out for us as readers. Although he does go to a certain extent, which I think is pretty obvious. He's like pretty strongly telling you very obvious hints, and the fact that people miss him is just telling you about them rather than the text. Go ahead. What are you going to say, Hyperion?
I was just going to say that it's not about making your defense, you know, because your defense doesn't matter. You don't need to justify the things that you've done. There can be no justification for the things that you've done, except to no longer do the, you know, like the bad things, I guess, and grow as a person. That's the trial. It's not, I can justify this. You know, this is what I was thinking at the time. It's retroactive valuation. No, it's never going to happen that way.
No, I mean, part
Not
of it is less about the judgment you receive and more about how you respond to it.
Sure, yeah.
You know, if you're guilty, you better accept that. You better accept your guilt and accept whatever may come of that.
Yeah, I guess not passive acceptance, but don't worry about the judgment.
Yeah.
It's like those who say, "Oh, I'm going to do good works because you get treasures in heaven." You'll hear this in fundamentalist circles. That's a failing of the trial, you know.
Hmm.
Expectation for riches is not an excuse to be good, or being good. You should not expect to get things for being good. Being good is its own reward, as we say.
Yep.
Growth, personal growth, and universal growth, as we were saying, is the goal. Should doubtless be the goal.
Indeed. So I think we'll leave it here for those who are listening. Hope you find it interesting. By the way, though I disagree with that comment, thank you for the comment. But I hope you don't take that my way of responding as being disdainful or angry about that. I appreciate it. But anyways, we'll leave it here. Goodbye.
Thank you for reading. Thank you for watching.
Yeah.
Yep.